When I first saw promotions for Wicked Part 1, I thought little of it. Over the last few years, filmmakers have been remaking or adapting popular movies for a quick buck. Wicked, the Broadway musical, was wildly popular in the early 2000s, and it makes sense with the current cinematic trends that someone would want to capitalize on that popularity. I had no intention of seeing the movie because the latest batch of remakes hasn't really taken films seriously. The whole point of remaking a story through a different medium, say a live action version of an animated movie or a film adaptation of a musical, is to allow that different medium to shape the story, to tell it in a way that it couldn't have been told through the old medium. Unfortunately, it seems like producers are more interested in bottling and selling nostalgia than they are in exploring the relationship between cinematic art and stories. But by the time Wicked released in theaters, I just finished reading a book on critical theory by Carl R. Truman, and was interested in seeing what sort of art this philosophy was influencing. So I bought a ticket, took my seat in the theater, and prepared to look for subtleties. Looking as I was for mere hints, I was surprised to find the main message is overwhelmingly compatible with critical theory. Before we walk through the movie itself, let's address the elephant in the room: critical theory. Up until a few years ago, the term critical theory, or CT for short, was an obscure legal theory only discussed in the confines of the ivory tower. More recently, it's become one of those political buzzwords that people throw around, even if they don't really understand it. So, before we discuss the movie, I'm going to give a very brief description of what CT is and how it emerged. If you're curious to know more, I recommend reading To Change All Worlds by Carl Truman. CT is a philosophy first developed by the Frankfurt School, a group of Jewish German Marxist scholars in the 20th century. As we may recall, Germany was not doing well in the aftermath of World War I. The Treaty of Versailles had crippled Germany with war debt, and the Germans knew they needed something different. German Marxists, of course, saw this as a perfect opportunity for a communist revolution. The bourgeoisie, that is the upper class, were unable to improve life for the proletariat, or the laboring class. But the bourgeoisie were still enjoying their rich life while everyone else slaved away with nothing to show for it, and everyone was wildly unhappy. For many Marxists, it seemed inevitable that the German people would rise up against their bourgeois oppressors and establish a communist state. Germany's current state was a textbook example of the kind of atmosphere necessary for a revolution. The Marxists were then shocked when, instead of gravitating toward communism, the German people openly embraced fascism and blamed the communist Russians and Jews for their troubles. Thus, the Frankfurt School set out to explain and respond to this unforeseen turn in their country. The result was the initial development of critical theory. Let's begin with the basic definition of CT. Critical theory is a method of explaining society, institutions, or systems that is inherently destructive to the way of thinking, which supports that society, institution, or system. See, the Frankfurt School was not merely academically interested in their country's turn to fascism. The school was horrified by it and ardently desired to stop it. Therefore, they believed they could not produce a theory that merely explained why Germans didn't turn to communism. No. The theory needed to destabilize the Nazi regime so that the German people would reject fascism and turn to communism. Now, obviously, CT has changed since the mid-1900s. Critical theorists today are not trying to destabilize the Third Reich, nor are they even necessarily pushing for communism. But the core belief of CT remains. Society at large, or particular institutions, are seen as oppressive. CT says we ought not merely to explain that they are oppressive, but to depict them in such a way that people lose trust in them. Once we have overturned society or particular institutions, then we can begin to build a community without oppression. This philosophy can be applied to a variety of concerns, regardless of whether they're Marxist. CT can influence economic movements, but also racial, psychological, and gender-based concerns. For instance, the Black Lives Matter website uses CT to address racial concerns. It says, "We affirm the abolition of any system that perpetuates violence against Black people, including prisons and police." The claim is not merely that some prisons or police officers commit acts of violence against Black people. It is that the law enforcement and penal systems inherently perpetuate racial violence. If such a claim is correct, it seems only logical that one would support the abolition of such systems. Thus, Black Lives Matter is trying to destabilize the system so that people can build something better. It may not be communist, but the movement is still using the core elements of CT to further its cause. With this broad overview in mind, let's return to Wicked. As we walk through the movie, we'll also consider some specific elements of CT. The movie opens with No One Mourns the Wicked, where the people of Oz, and especially Munchkinland, are rejoicing over the death of the Wicked Witch of the West. This clues us into the fact that we're picking up where the Wizard of Oz left off. Nobody is singing Ding Dong the Witch is Dead, but the sentiment is the same. Glinda, the Good Witch, comes to affirm the good news and is about to hurry off in her magical bubble device when one of the Munchkins asks about the witch's backstory. Glinda makes a show of not being able to hear it in the bubble, but she's eventually able to hear the question and starts telling the story. What I initially took as a small exchange to show that Glinda is a ditzy blonde, I now realize is a brilliant opening to the story. See, the point of the story is that everyone has it all wrong. The Wicked Witch isn't actually wicked at all. Glinda, like the rest of Oz, is encapsulated in her own little world, her own bubble, and is unable to hear any other narrative than her own. It's not until the bubble is popped that real conversation can begin, and the truly good nature of the Wicked Witch is revealed. This is very similar to the intention behind CT. To Marxists, Marxism, obviously, seems like the only solution. But if it's the only solution, then why doesn't everyone realize that? It's because of what they call false consciousness. This is the phenomenon whereby oppressed people accept their oppression because they think of it as normal or necessary. They accept their oppression so much that they no longer recognize it as oppression at all. Think of the Marxist critique of the average worker. Most people sell the majority of their time to a corporation. When these people come home from work, they are not energized and ready to live life to the fullest. Instead, they are weary and insist on resting or even medicating so that they can be ready to go to work the next day.
What's on next?
I don't know. There gotta be something.
Though work was supposed to fuel their lives, it now turns out that their lives are fuel for their work. And yet, though many people grumble about their jobs, they are not ready to overthrow the corporations which perpetuate this upside-down lifestyle. This is what Marxists mean by false consciousness. These people whose lives are being sucked away do not realize they're being oppressed, which is why they will not support anything that destabilizes the system. The role of CT, then, is to break down the false consciousness so that people wake up to the oppression around them. In other words, the role of CT is to pop the bubble, to show a different narrative, to instill in people a distrust of the system. So it is notable that the different narrative in Wicked does not emerge until Glinda hears the cry of the common people and pops her bubble. We are soon introduced to the main character and the main problem. Elphaba is the illegitimate daughter of the Munchkinland governor's wife and an unknown man. Because her mother drank some green elixir around the time of conception, Elphaba turns out to be green, much to everyone's horror. As I'm sure everyone who watched the movie noticed, green is a metaphor for being black. Elphaba is portrayed as being relentlessly rejected all her life because of her skin color. Her father doesn't want her, other children mysteriously appear in the governor's backyard to laugh at her, and her arrival at Chiz University is met with shocked and disgusted stares, and even a squeal of terror at one point. When Glinda first sees Elphaba, she publicly promises to fix her condition once she learns enough magic. Elphaba quickly establishes the moral high ground by pointing out that her skin color isn't a problem that needs to be fixed. Elphaba isn't just discriminated against because of her skin color, she's also portrayed as being underprivileged. While at a university that is undeniably bourgeois, Elphaba has terrible clothing, cannot seem to afford housing, and is the only one in class who cares about the history of oppression. This is all a little awkward given that she's the daughter of a governor. Even though she was technically raised by a servant, that only highlights the fact that she was raised in a house with servants. When Elphaba suddenly decides to attend college, there is no mention made about scholarship money, which implies that her family can pay for it out of pocket. Still, she is not depicted as another rich kid, but as the only one who isn't a rich kid. Add to this the fact that Elphaba possesses magical ability that everyone considers frightful and destructive, and we get a clear picture of someone who is oppressed and underprivileged. Meanwhile, of course, the rest of society is depicted as a bunch of stuck-up, ignorant buffoons. Galinda, of course, is the pretty rich white girl who's always used to getting her way. At first, she can't even handle that her goat professor, Dr. Dillamond, cannot pronounce her name correctly.
Yes, Miss Glinda.
Though Galinda has 2 lackeys, they, along with the entire student body, really don't serve any purpose other than supporting Galinda. Yet, I think the message comes across just fine. Shortly after the film released, I had the opportunity to talk to a teenager in my community about it. The response I got was that this teen felt sorry for the Green Lady, and really didn't like the other people, especially the 2 people always hanging around Galinda. I take this to mean that the movie got across exactly what it wanted. We as the audience are supposed to feel bad for Elphaba and disgust for the people around her. If the societal strains are not enough, there is the animal issue. As we may remember from characters like the Cowardly Lion and the Wizard of Oz, in this world, animals have human-level intelligence. We get almost nothing of the history on this, but we know that the public opinion is turning against animals, removing them from offices, forcing many to exile, etc. We learn most of this when Elphaba eavesdrops on a meeting of talking animals who are trying to understand and respond to their times. We later learn that the government is systematically hunting down talking animals and trying to steal from them their power of speech. This should sound familiar. Critical theory was developed by Marxist Jews living in Germany during the rise of Nazism. The Nazis removed people from offices they did not support, they suppressed their speech, they denied the Jews' humanity, and they systematically went about eradicating this perceived threat. It's difficult not to see this meeting between Dr. Dillamond and his friends as a nod to the Frankfurt School. Certainly, anyone in Oz should be horrified at this, just as anyone in Germany should have been horrified by Nazi policies. But it seems only 2 humans in Oz actually take this threat seriously. When Dr. Dillamond is removed from his teaching post and replaced by a government-approved professor, the class is presented with a caged animal. Elphaba immediately uses her magic. Now, I haven't said much about her magical skills yet, because there's almost no rhyme or reason to them. All we know about her magic is that she can only use it if she's outraged against oppression, that she's much more magical than anyone else, and that her magic can do pretty much whatever it needs to for the plot. And this scene, she puts everyone in her class to sleep except for Fiyero. Fiyero takes the lead in rescuing the animal, and the 2 escape to share a scene that's either about social justice or romance. What's of note, though, is that these 2 characters are the only ones who care about social justice, and so are the only ones who are literally awake to deal with the problem. The rest of society sleeps during oppression, but it is only by being awake or woke to the oppressive structures of society that one can make a difference. This is emphasized later when Galinda stands up against Dr. Dillamond's removal by officially changing her name from Galinda to Glinda, the way he pronounced it. The NPC crowd loves it, and Glinda feels very proud of herself. The message is clear. Trying to fight oppression within the system won't work.
Let's start with an example from The Office.
I have another complaint for Jim's permanent file.
Talk to Michael. I gave him the box.
What box?
Dino reports you're snoring like you.
Oh,
What? Oh, no!
4 years of malfeasance unreported. This cannot stand.
Calm down.
No, you calm down. Whose side is Toby on? Whose side are you on?
Hey!
If you haven't seen this episode from The Office, that's fine. The bit is pretty clear. Dwight has apparently been filing complaints against Jim for the past 5 years. Yet the complaints haven't actually been going to corporate, instead they've just been going to Toby's dusty box. When Dwight learns about this, he's, of course, furious, because the very system that he's been relying on to take care of the problem proves to be corrupt. This is essentially how critical theorists view peaceful protests in a corrupt or oppressive society. They say, well, you can make peaceful protests, but all it really does is make people feel better about living in the corrupt society. Peaceful protests can't help anything because it's relying on the broken system to fix the broken system. Brokenness can't fix brokenness.
Stop.
Him or me. I cannot work with Jim anymore.
Okay.
No, either he goes or I go.
Dwight.
You choose.
Stop.
One of us is out of here by the end of today.
Here's how one critical theorist, Herbert Marcuse, puts it. under a system of constitutionally guaranteed and practiced civil rights and liberties, opposition and dissent are tolerated, unless they issue in violence and or in exhortation to and organization of violent subversion. The underlying assumption is that the established society is free, that any improvement, even a change in the social structure and social values, will come about in the normal course of events, prepared, defined, and tested in free and equal discussion on the open marketplace of ideas and goods. Marcuse's point is simple. Society will gladly tolerate criticism as long as that criticism does not produce violent change. It teaches everyone that real change can only be made within the system, and so it mollifies anyone who wants change. Marcuse continues, when tolerance mainly serves the protection and preservation of a repressive society, when it serves to neutralize opposition and to render men immune against other and better forms of life, then tolerance has been perverted. That is, when societal tolerance actually just serves to keep people in their state of oppression, then something has gone horribly wrong. People, confused by false consciousness, believe that verbal protest is all they can do. This is why everyone is so pleased when Glinda changes her name. In their eyes, she is doing the best that could possibly be done to confront oppression. But the audience, along with Elphaba, knows full well that changing her name will do absolutely nothing. And so both the protagonist and the audience become dissatisfied with the liberal society's method for sorting out problems. But immediately after this, Elphaba still enjoys all the glories of the Emerald City with Glinda. Before she can fully embrace revolution, Elphaba must experience the phenomenon CT calls alienation. Alienation is the process by which something that was once related becomes unrelated, becomes other. A good example of this would be Eduardo Saverin in The Social Network. Though Eduardo helps Mark Zuckerberg build Facebook, the whole frame of the story hinges on the fact that Mark has alienated Eduardo. Eduardo was once Mark's best friend. Now they're enemies. Eduardo was once a partner in Facebook. Now he's barely a shareholder. What once belonged to him has now become other.
Mark!
He's wired in. Sorry? He's wired in.
Is he?
Yes.
How about now? You still wired in?
Here's how Karl Marx describes this phenomenon. Political economy conceals the estrangement inherent in the nature of labor by not considering the direct relationship between the worker and production. It is true that labor produces for the rich wonderful things, but for the worker, it produces privation. It produces palaces, but for the worker, hovels. It produces beauty, but for the worker, deformity. It replaces labor by machines, but it throws one section of the workers back into barbarous types of labor, and it turns the other section into a machine. In other words, Marx is saying that our methods of production alienate the worker. He may make wonderful objects, but he does not get to enjoy them as such. He does not have the natural connection between the craftsman and what he's crafted. Instead, the rich get to own what's been crafted, and the worker is forced to keep making that which he will never enjoy if he is to survive at all. It may be better than using a machine to make goods, but it makes the craftsman himself into a sort of machine. Nobody thinks about who makes their clothes, processes their meat, or assembles their cars. Nearly everything we own was made by someone else. Yet we consider these objects ours and give no more thought to the people who made them than we do to machines. The workers, Marxists would say, have been utterly alienated from their work and from the rest of society. Elphaba must undergo this process of alienation before completely turning against society. The wizard and Madame Morrible have Elphaba read from their ancient spellbook, and are delighted to find that she can use it better than anyone else. For some reason. This is never explained. I don't really understand it. But they use her to give the monkey guards their wings, and Elphaba learns that these winged monkeys are to be spies on talking animals. I want to pause for a second and note that from a storytelling perspective, this is really lazy. For some reason, the wizard reveals his devilish plot against the animals, even though Elphaba literally just told him that her deepest wish was to help the animals. I also don't know why flying monkeys would be able to spot talking animals any better than regular monkeys could. Regardless, Elphaba is horrified at what she's done. The final product of her labor is not at all what she expected, and the monkeys serve the owner of the book. not her. That is, her product belongs to the owner of the means of production, not the laborer. She's been alienated from her work. It produces riches for the wizard, privation for her. It enhances his palace, but forces her into exile. To the wizard, the monkeys are magnificent, beautiful. To Elphaba, they're horrible, deformed. The wizard realizes he has access to real magic now, that he need not rely on his machines. But to do so, he must use Elphaba like a machine. In other words, Elphaba experiences textbook alienation. Instead of listening to the soothing lies of society, Elphaba rebels. She takes the spellbook, that is, she seizes the means of production and runs, enchants a broom and escapes. During that sequence, Elphaba sings the famous Defying Gravity song, and some of the words really reinforce the CT perspective. This is precisely what CT tries to communicate. Playing by someone else's rules only means you lose. It enables oppression. And once you realize you're in an oppressive system, you can't ignore it. You've got to do something that everyone thinks is crazy because it's the only way to make a difference. As Elphaba flies away, Madame Morrible announces to all Oz that Elphaba is the one responsible for all the evil doings, and that she is wicked.
Citizens of Oz, there is an enemy who must be found and captured. She has stolen our grimoire, responsible for the mutilation of these poor, innocent monkeys. Her green skin is but an outward manifestorium of her twisted nature. This wicked witch.
The movie ends by suggesting that the entire reason we think someone is evil is because we are being subjected to false consciousness. No, the film says, Elphaba isn't evil. She's the only one who's willing to stand up against oppression, and for that, she's labeled by the oppressors as evil. Don't we wish we were more like Elphaba? Don't we wish we could notice and respond to oppression? Don't we wish we trusted society and its systems less and thought more for ourselves? This movie seeks to explain society in such a way that it inherently destabilizes how we think about it. Which is to say, this film is a work of critical theory. My intent behind this analysis is not merely to intellectually explain a movie, but to equip others to view this work of art with discernment. While I certainly have not talked to a great number of people who watched Wicked Part 1, the majority of those I have talked to have positively received the movie. My argument is not that we should hate the movie. Indeed, it has much to recommend it. A great set, interesting cinematography, and the familiar and beloved musical numbers. That is actually part of why we ought to evaluate it as art and not mere entertainment. Just as the aesthetic value of a painting depends in some capacity on its meaning, the value of a film depends in some capacity on its message. While this is true of film in general, we ought to pay particular regard to movies that are marketed to children as much as to adults. The Romantic poet Percy Shelley famously remarked that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. That is, the popular artist shapes our imagination in ways that we do not easily recognize. In his Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis points out that even grammar books may unduly influence schoolchildren. The very power, he says, of these authors depends on the fact that they are dealing with a boy who thinks he is doing his English prep and has no notion that ethics, theology, and politics are all at stake. We may make the same statement of any family movie, including Wicked. I have no intention of telling parents whether they should allow their children to see this movie. I have every intention of making viewers aware, whether they are parents or not, of precisely what sort of claims Wicked is making. To that end, I would like to make 4 comments about the flaws in Wicked's message. First, it offers no positive vision. Following Elphaba's journey, we learn to distrust or despise the Munchkins, the students and faculty at Shiz University, and the wizard with his cronies. Which is to say, we learn to think poorly of everyone who is not the victim of social injustice. This is not surprising. Max Horkheimer, one of the Frankfurt School's members, wrote, critical theory has no specific influence on its side except concern for the abolition of social injustice. That is, CT is not concerned with establishing anything, only with tearing down what exists. As Truman points out, this echoes Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Yet Wicked, like most critical theories, is strangely silent when it comes to describing that new world. At least in part 1, Elphaba has no vision for what the world should be, nothing that offers hope or could inspire viewers. The effect is that we are left with a general distrust of stability. This is not to say that every institution is perfect, but we certainly cannot hope to gain something better by embracing anarchical tendencies. Second, Wicked offers an inconsistent view of human nature. On the one hand, society is corrupt, and even the best people are helplessly naive. On the other hand, Elphaba is depicted as being naturally good-natured. The only way destabilizing society could work out for humanity is if people can be trusted to make the right decision when it is time to rebuild. But what we're constantly shown is that people cannot be trusted. The idea may be that once the people of Oz cast off their false consciousness, they will automatically know what to do. However, the film offers no positive evidence that would lead us to conclude that human nature leans toward goodness. Viewers are presented with a world where human nature is depraved enough to justly condemn those in power, while it is also good enough for humanity to save itself without the help of God. It gives us just enough knowledge of evil to scoff at the speck on our brother's eye, but not enough to realize we might have a log in our own. Third, Wicked offers an intellectually impoverished philosophy. Intellectually robust paradigms have what we could call a breaking point. That is, they are structured in such a way that the right evidence, if it existed, could completely dismantle the entire paradigm. This is another way of saying that all intellectually rich ideas have a foundation. If a paradigm does not have a breaking point, if it is impossible to disprove, that's because it doesn't have any evidentiary foundation. G.K. Chesterton discusses this in Orthodoxy with his madman. Once a madman adopts an idea, say that he is the subject of a Truman Show-like operation, nothing can convince him that he is wrong. Once he has accepted there is a conspiracy, everything he sees can be interpreted as part of the conspiracy.
Oh, I can't believe I didn't see this before.
What?
You are trying to throw me off because my life is the Truman Show!
Excuse me?
Oh, real clever move up there, director of the Dawn Show!
Wow, this is a whole nother...
The problem, of course, is that he does not have any positive evidence that could reasonably push him to conclude that his life is like the Truman Show. He assumes it for no reason. Critical theory suffers from the same problem. Once you assume society suffers from false consciousness, everything that disagrees with you only confirms your suspicion. The problem is that the assumption of false consciousness itself is merely that, an assumption. It has no positive evidence. Wicked certainly provides evidence for a false consciousness in its own world, but it does nothing to realistically comment about our world. Yet it still plants the idea, the seed, in the minds of any passive viewers that our society is just as untrustworthy. That is, it gently nudges viewers toward making that unfounded assumption. Fourth, and finally, the movie offers a blatantly unbiblical conception of morality. Wickedness, we learn, is a category created by those in power to stay in power. It alienates threats from society. This is shockingly similar to the argument Nietzsche makes in the first book of The Genealogy of Morals. To be clear, Nietzsche was no critical theorist, yet this idea certainly worked with Marx's claim that religion is an opioid, that it dulls people to reality and addicts them to serving their oppressor. This suggests that our very conception of evil is itself wrong. That if we want to have an unoppressive society, we have to reject the traditional concept of evil. I wonder how much we can immerse ourselves in the story without letting go of a biblical conception of sin and wickedness. Again, I'm not claiming that watching Wicked is immoral, but I am claiming that if we read the movie correctly, we will find a dangerous philosophy embedded in it. Let us not be passive consumers of art, but careful readers of it.